Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, one of the main themes in the book of Exodus is servitude. Throughout the book, God's people are always serving someone, whether it be the pharaohs in Egypt or the idols of their own making, or in their best moments, the one true God. Throughout the narrative of this book, the question for them is not whether to serve or not to serve, but rather who should they serve. Another way to put the question is, to whom do we owe our ultimate obedience and reverence? The answer to that question for them and for us really comes down to the difference between two different types of lords. The Lord of the world, which can be found in various guises throughout history, or the Lord of heaven and earth. Last week, we began a new sermon series in the book of Exodus, and I talked about how this book is really just a continuation of the first book, the book of Genesis. It continues a story that has been building ever since the first chapter of the Bible. It's in Genesis that we're introduced to Abraham, who becomes the founder of the Hebrew people, the Jews. God promises him that he will have many offspring and that those descendants will inherit the land of Canaan, which is pretty much modern-day Israel. In chapter 15 of Genesis, God makes a covenant with Abraham, a binding agreement initiated by God that ensures Abraham's descendants' inheritance of the land. But it's right in the middle of that covenant promise that God tells Abraham this would not happen immediately. Instead, his descendants would sojourn in a strange land for about 400 years, and only afterwards would God bring them out of that land and back into Canaan. And so it's with those promises in mind that we should approach the book of Exodus. Exodus picks up where Genesis leaves off, which is what we saw in the first paragraph of the book last week. Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, had been sent down to Egypt as a slave. But God ended up lifting him up to the most powerful position in the nation, second only to Pharaoh himself. Then, during a famine in Canaan, Joseph's father and brothers migrated down to Egypt to come under Joseph's care and to dwell in a land called Goshen. And while dwelling in Goshen, the Israelites prospered. Even after Joseph dies, it says there in verse 7, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So even though they were strangers in a strange land, God was continuing to bless them, to maintain the promises that he'd made to Abraham hundreds of years ago. And they would continue to be prosperous for about 200 years after Joseph's death, until a new regime takes the throne. Today, we see the beginning of the problem that will initiate the whole narrative of Exodus. God's people go from being prosperous and free to impoverished and oppressed. And yet we can see glimpses, even in this early part of the story, of God's faithfulness to his people. In the text that we're looking at today, there are two kings that couldn't be any more different. There's a worldly king and a heavenly king. And everything hangs on how the people of Israel respond to those two kings. The outline of today's message is pretty basic. Verses 8 through 14, we can see the oppression of a worldly king. And then in verses 15 through 22, we can see obedience to a heavenly king. So looking again there at verses 8 through 10, we read, "Now there arose a king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.'" Joseph had been a great asset to the nation of Egypt. It was through his ability to prophesy the future and his wisdom that Egypt was able to ride out the years of famine and maintain its status as a superpower among the nations. The Pharaoh, who was the contemporary of Joseph, certainly knew that, and apparently so did the pharaohs who came after him for the next 200 years. But there came a point in time in which a new king, a new Pharaoh rose up who did not know Joseph. Now, chances are he knew of Joseph because he obviously knew about Joseph's descendants who were multiplying rapidly within his borders. Yet he did not acknowledge what Joseph had done for his nation in previous generations. All he could see was a very large group of foreigners who were taking up some of his best land and who were becoming ever larger by the day. So he started to look upon the Hebrew people with suspicion and even a little bit of fear. And from that point forward, he began to follow the playbook used by almost every other tyrant in world history. If a tyrant wants to oppress a minority group with the support of the majority group, he tells the majority that the minority group is in some way dangerous and needs to be put under control. Chances are the Pharaoh simply didn't like the Hebrew people from day one. So he decides to sound the alarmist note and make it seem as if the Hebrews pose a real threat to the peace of Egyptian society. He makes it sound as if subjugating them is the prudent thing to do. He says again there in verse 10, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us." He wanted his people to believe that the Hebrews would rise up against the Egyptians and ally themselves with their enemies at the drop of a hat, even though there is no historical precedence for such a fear. Now, just a quick note about the ending of verse 10. In most English translations, including the ESV, it says at the end of verse 10, "Fight against us and escape from the land." But if we go with that translation, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense given the context. The Pharaoh is concerned that the Hebrews will fight against the Egyptians alongside their enemies, not that they will escape from Egypt. If anything, the Hebrews leaving Egypt instead of fighting alongside their enemies would be the best possible scenario for the Egyptians. So, according to some Hebrew scholars, the verb that's in the last part of verse 10 can alternatively be translated as overflow or consume. And we can think of a river overflowing its banks and consuming all the land around it. And that sense seems to be much closer to what the Pharaoh would have been afraid of, or at least what he wanted other people to be afraid of. It was a fear of the Hebrew people overtaking the land, not escaping from the land. And so his first step in oppressing the Israelites is to make them do hard labor, the ruthless, bitter labor of slaves. No longer would the Israelites be free to graze their sheep and tend their own farms. Now they would have to work for the Pharaoh himself. And many of the working age men would be taken away from their homes to go and build store cities beyond their homeland. And yet notice what happens there in verse 12. It says again, "But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel." God had promised their forefather Abraham hundreds of years before that the offspring of the Israelites would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And God stayed true to that promise, both before their oppression and even more remarkably during their oppression. It was as if the Egyptians, try as they might, could do nothing to quell God's blessings to the Israelites. God was blessing the Israelites because they were his covenant people. Remember that God's covenant with his people is a major theme throughout the whole Bible, especially in the Old Testament. In its most basic form, it's God saying, I will be your God, and you will be my people. Now, of course, that didn't mean that God's people would never see hardship. It didn't mean that they would always be prosperous and comfortable. But it did mean that God would never leave them. He would never simply abandon his people to the evils of the world. He would always be by their side. And the fact that the Israelites only continued to multiply in the midst of their oppression is evidence of that. Well, it can sometimes be hard for us as 21st century Christians to really understand how what we read in the Old Testament has any relevance for our own lives. But as I said last week, ancient Israel's story is our story too. What God's old covenant people went through physically is very much like what God's new covenant people go through spiritually. And so even though we may not be experiencing physical oppression right now, we are always in the midst of spiritual oppression. We are always in one way or another burdened by our sin or by the sin of others. And not only that, because we are finite creatures who live in a fallen world, we are going to physically suffer sometimes. But then there are those Christians around the world who are experiencing very intense physical oppression by those who have more power than they do. And sometimes that oppression takes the form of outright persecution for their faith, as we see in places like China or India. In other places, Christians are subjugated, along with the rest of the population, to oppression by a cruel dictator or an unjust government. And there are even people within our own country who are being oppressed physically and economically by unjust working conditions and ridiculously low wages. Oppression, both spiritual and physical, was not just something that happened in biblical times. And God's faithfulness to his people in the midst of oppression was not just something that happened to Israel way back when. God's character has not changed. He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Therefore, if we believe what we read, that God allowed the Israelites to thrive even as they were being oppressed, then we can also believe that God will do the same for us. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that God is going to make sure we have lots of children. That was a promise given specifically to the Israelites of that time. But it does mean that God is going to walk us through whatever it is that we're going through right now. God doesn't run out on his children when things get difficult. He doesn't just turn us loose into the world and say, good luck. No, he is always right there with us through the Holy Spirit. And if you allow it, his presence will give you a sense of peace, even in the midst of the worst suffering, even in the midst of grieving over the loss of a loved one, even in the midst of worrying about the choices of our children or grandchildren, even in the midst of uncertainty about your job or your future aspirations or your ability to retire without being impoverished. God is seeing you through every bit of it. And he does so not because he has to, but because he chooses to. He chose to make an everlasting covenant through his Son, Jesus Christ, out of love for us, not out of obligation. And that really is at the core of the gospel. God brought us up out of our sinful, fallen state, and he adopted us as one of his own sons or daughters. So that now our family of origin doesn't define us. Our past doesn't define us. Our continued struggles with sin don't even define us. Christ and Christ alone defines us if we trust in him. As a Christian, you will continue to suffer as long as you live in this world. And there's nothing about being a believer that makes you impervious to that. But the difference between us and the world is that we have hope. Hope that one day we will suffer no more. And that hope gives us a sense of peace and a resolve to stay faithful to God, come what may. And that's precisely the attitude that we see playing out in the Hebrew midwives in the next section of our text today. So the Pharaoh eventually realizes that his plan to crush the expansion of the Israelites isn't really working. Therefore, he adds another layer to his plan: infanticide. Verses 15 and 16 again says, "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, 'When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live.'" The Pharaoh thinks that if making all the adults do hard labor isn't working, then more drastic measures are necessary, like killing all the newborn boys, thus destroying an entire nation of Hebrew men, an entire generation. But why did he target the male children? Well, probably because of his chief fear that the Israelites would eventually decide to make war with their host nation. Therefore, getting rid of future generations of fighting men was what was needed. So he gives the horrific order to the Hebrew midwives to kill the infant boys as soon as they're born, somehow without the mothers suspecting anything. But thankfully, the Pharaoh underestimated the courage and faithfulness of these women. Continuing in verse 17, we read, "But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live." Now, this is the first instance in the book of Exodus where we see the name of God. Up to this point, it would almost seem as if this is just a story about human actors struggling against one another. But verse 17 reminds us that we're not reading the history of just any people. We're reading the history of God's people. These are the people that God had made his covenant with in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they are still his people at this point in their history that we're reading about right now as they reside in Egypt. So the Israelites seem to have kept alive the stories of their ancestors. They knew about the patriarchs and the covenant promises, and most importantly, they knew about God. Now, as far as we know, they didn't have any kind of written scripture at this point in time. Most or all of what they knew was passed down through the telling of stories, which is how most knowledge was conferred in ancient times. And it seems that these Hebrew midwives at least knew enough about their God to know that he would not approve of killing infants. And that would almost seem to go without saying, but we have to remember that in various places throughout the ancient world, infanticide and child sacrifice was considered more or less normal. That was one of the many abominations of the Canaanites, who would sacrifice children to their gods in order to get better crops for the next year or some other favorable outcome. But the Hebrew midwives knew that their God was not like the bloodthirsty gods of the Canaanites or the immoral gods of the Egyptians. Their God was the standard of all that was good and right. And one of the things that is good and right is the existence of human life. Killing infants, whether inside the womb or outside of it, is morally abhorrent, which is why many modern-day Christians are rightfully opposed to abortion, and why the Hebrew midwives several thousand years ago refused to kill newborn babies. And they refused to do so because they were more concerned with obeying their true king rather than an earthly king. It's interesting that the author of Exodus goes back and forth between using the title Pharaoh and then using the title King of Egypt in order to name the same person. He could have just used the title Pharaoh all the way through, but he chose to use King of Egypt as well. Probably because this is his subtle way of emphasizing a distinction between the kingship of an earthly wicked king and the kingship of a heavenly and absolutely good king. The true king, not only of the earth, but of the entire universe, is God Almighty. And that's something the Hebrew people acknowledged ever since the time of Abraham. And that's what the two Hebrew midwives acknowledge as they defy the orders of a wicked earthly king. They probably weren't out to break laws according to their own whims. They were most likely very quiet, law-abiding citizens of Egypt. But when it came down to choosing between obeying the will of an evil decree, an evil dictator, an evil king, or the righteous moral standard of their heavenly king, they chose the latter. And their names will be remembered forever because of that. Notice that the name of the Pharaoh is never given, all throughout the book of Exodus. The leader of what was probably the most powerful nation in the world at that time is not even given the honor of having a name. But these two midwives, who normally would have been considered nothing in the eyes of most historians, are both named and memorialized in Scripture because they chose to fear God and not man. And with all of that said, there are a couple of moral quandaries that this text raises for us as Christians. We've already seen one, but let's go ahead and look at the other one so we can get both of them in front of us. Let's continue reading there in verses 18 through 21. It says, "So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, 'Why have you done this, and let the male children live?' The midwives said to Pharaoh, 'Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them.' So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families." So the first moral quandary that this text raises is that of the midwives disobeying a direct order from their ruling authority. And this becomes an issue for us as Christians because of what Paul says in Romans 13, verse 1. He says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Now, if we only took what Paul said in Romans in isolation from everything else in the Bible, it would seem as if we're supposed to obey the government no matter what, no matter how wicked the ruler is or how unjust the laws are. But the overall message of Scripture is that we are to be subject to the governing authorities, yes, but only when those authorities are leading us to act in a morally just way. So if your government is wanting you to do something immoral or that blatantly goes against God, then you have not only the right but the responsibility to defy it. And we can see examples of that principle throughout the Bible. The most obvious of which is probably the book of Daniel. In that book, many of the Israelites had been brought to the pagan nation of Babylon during the exile, including the prophet Daniel and 3 of his friends. They were made to serve in the court of the king, Nebuchadnezzar, and they did so obediently. But when it came time for Daniel's friends to bow down to a statue as if it were a god, they refused. And of course, that's what precipitated the famous episode of the fiery furnace. But the point is, there was a line that Daniel's friends would not cross when it came to obeying earthly authorities. They probably didn't like having to live in Babylon and serve a foreign king, but they did it. But when the king wanted them to basically turn their backs on God and worship an idol, they said no. They feared God more than they feared Nebuchadnezzar. And then later in Daniel, a decree goes out from King Darius that no one would be permitted to pray openly to their God. But what does Daniel do? He goes straight to his upstairs room, he opens up the windows wide, and he begins praying to the God of Israel. Well, those are biblical instances of what we now call civil disobedience. And of course, when you get to the New Testament in the book of Acts, the apostles are constantly disobeying the Jewish authorities as they seek to promote the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the representative line from Acts, which pretty much echoes what the author of Exodus says about the Hebrew midwives, is this. Acts 5:29. So Peter and the apostles are before the Sanhedrin, and they say, "We must obey God rather than men." For them, civil disobedience was a matter of godly obedience. And even beyond the biblical record, we can see faithful Christians employing civil disobedience throughout history. In the 1930s and 40s, many German Christians chose to defy the orders of the Nazi government. They formed what was called the Confessing Church over against the state church that professed allegiance to Hitler. The Confessing Church produced a document called the Barmen Declaration, whose chief author was the Swiss theologian Karl Barth. And in that confession of faith, they professed obedience to Christ and Christ alone, not to any earthly authorities who would attempt to demand their ultimate allegiance. They basically said, Christ is our king, not Caesar, and certainly not Hitler. And then a little further on in history, you have the civil rights movement in the 1960s, which was led by Christian ministers like Martin Luther King Jr. And one of the things that protesters like King himself did and everyday citizens like Rosa Parks was to defy the racist segregation laws that turned people of color into second-class citizens. And of course, there are numerous other examples throughout history that could be cited, but I think we get the point. Whenever a wicked ruler or government tries to impose unjust, ungodly laws on a people or a nation, it seems very clear that God allows believers to rise up in defiance of those laws. But as I mentioned, there is another moral conundrum or another layer to what the Hebrew midwives did in the text that we're looking at today. And it's that we see that they blatantly lied to Pharaoh. They tell Pharaoh that they intended to kill the infant boys, but the Hebrew women give birth too quickly, so they didn't have enough time to get there. We couldn't do anything about it. So what are we to make of this? Well, normally God's standard is for us to always tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. And one of the 10 Commandments is you shall not bear false witness. And yet it's not hard to imagine situations like the one that the Hebrew midwives were in which it may not be best to tell the truth. And we don't even have to imagine those situations because just like those acts of civil disobedience, followers of God have used deception in various ways throughout history. In the Bible, military leaders like Joshua and David used tactics that involved elements of deception in order to get the jump on the enemy. In the book of Joshua, Rahab, the prostitute, is spoken of in honorable terms because she lies to her fellow Canaanites so that she can protect the Israelite spies. And once again, we can think about Nazi Germany and the persecution of the Jews. The Nazis went from house to house looking for any Jews that might be residing there to haul them away to concentration camps. So if you were a Christian and there was a Jewish family hiding out in your basement, you would be forced to make a decision whether or not to lie in order to save lives. And of course, there were others who engaged in covert resistance and espionage against the Nazis as well, all of which had to engage in some form of deception. Well, there have certainly been some gray areas throughout world history when it comes to whether or not deception was the godly way to handle things. But the author of Exodus makes it quite clear how God thought about this situation in particular. And God doesn't castigate or judge these midwives for lying to the Pharaoh. Instead, he blesses them, giving them families of their own, which they didn't have before. God wanted to preserve his people. And one of the ways that he allowed that to happen was through the civil disobedience and deception of 2 faithful midwives. Besides God himself, the 2 midwives are really the heroes or heroines of the first chapter of Exodus. As soon as Pharaoh found out something wasn't right, he could have immediately had them killed. They risked their lives for the lives of others. But we would be wrong to say that their heroics were simply a matter of them being strong and courageous in and of themselves. Paradoxically, their courage came from fear. Because they had a healthy fear of God, they did not fear man. The Bible often exhorts us to fear God. And as I've explained before, that's not supposed to be a kind of cowering fear. Not the same type of fear that we'd experience at the threats of a tyrant or a murderer, but rather a deep reverence for the presence and power of God. If we truly understand that God is holy and just, that he has all power and all knowledge, then that should cause us to treat him with a sense of awe and a desire to do whatever he wants us to do. I've used the illustration before of the Grand Canyon. If you have a healthy sense of fear for the Grand Canyon, then you're not just going to walk right up to the edge and start dancing around. No, you're going to inch your way up to it and then peer down at its beauty and grandeur. If we truly know the character of God, then we're going to treat him in a similar way. Shiphrah and Puah knew this God. And they knew that fearing him was the wisest thing that they could do, even if it cost them their lives. So it's not as if they had no fear. Rather, they had the right kind of fear. When it came to choosing between faithfulness to someone who could kill the body but not the soul, or else the one who had power over both body and soul, they made the best choice. As human beings, it can often be hard to do what is right, to honor God. If we do, we might risk ridicule from our coworkers or classmates. We might risk being shut out from various jobs or snubbed by those whom we deeply respect. We might even risk being persecuted or killed. But I hope that when it comes down to making a choice, we would all choose the right kind of fear. The midwives feared God, not man, and then they served him. So who do you fear? Who do you serve?